The road to the monastery was barely visible under the thick fog rolling over the hills. The 5 friends Ethan, Sam, Lily, Jake, and Natalie walked along a cracked stone path, their flashlights flickering in the cold autumn air. The monastery had been abandoned for almost a century, its dark silhouette looming against the blood-red sky in the setting sun. "This place gives me the creeps," Lily muttered as she wrapped her jacket tighter. "That's the point," Jake smiled. "We're here for the thrill, aren't we?" Sam, the most skeptical of the group, scoffed. "It's just an old building. No ghosts. No demons. Just a bunch of rotten wood and dust." They reached the entrance, where 2 massive doors, ravaged by time, were slightly ajar. A gust of icy wind whispered through the opening, carrying the faint scent of decay. Ethan hesitated before pushing it open. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous hall bathed in moonlight. Tall columns stood along the walls, casting oblong shadows that seemed to move on their own. A grand staircase led up into the darkness. "This place is massive," Natalie whispered. Jake ran ahead, his voice echoing. "Let's find the bedrooms. Who wants the spookiest room?" No one laughed. The air inside was thick and oppressive. A deep silence settled over them as they wandered through the monastery, their footsteps muffled by the dusty stone. In one room they saw rows of wooden beds, some still covered with tattered sheets. On the floor were old prayer books with torn and yellowed pages. A large wooden cross hung askew on the wall. "We'll stay here tonight," Ethan decided. "If we hear anything strange, we'll stick together." As they were laying out their sleeping bags, a distant sound was heard in the corridor's deep, hollow thud, as if someone had dropped something heavy. "What was that?" Lily's voice trembled. "It was probably just a piece of the ceiling falling in," Sam reasoned. But even he wasn't convinced. Night had fallen. The wind outside howled through the broken windows and whispered in the corridors. One by one, they fell asleep. When morning came, Sam was gone. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, but empty. His flashlight lay next to him, flickering faintly. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no sign that he had left. Just nothing. Natalie let out a shaky breath. "Where the hell is Sam?" Silence answered her. Then, from the hallway, they heard its slow, cautious footsteps. They were getting closer. The steps were slow, cautious. Each step echoed in the empty corridors, causing a cold fear to creep up his spine. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the doorway, holding his breath. "Sam?" he called, whispering barely audibly. There was no response. The footsteps stopped. Jake clenched his fists. "This is ridiculous. He's got to be messing with us." He ran to the hall, but before he could get out, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed the room. A faint whisper slipped through the air. Not words, just a sound like the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. A cold draft swept past them, carrying the smell of something rotten. Natalie groaned. "We need to get out of here." Lily fumbled with the flashlight until it finally turned on, casting a flickering beam into the hallway. The hallway was empty. The dust on the floor was still. Ethan's hands were shaking. "Okay, we're not splitting up. We're going to stay together and find Sam." They moved as a group, walking through the ancient halls, the silence pressing on their ears. The monastery seemed different now, bigger, somehow. The shadows stretched for an incredibly long time, their outlines changing when no one was looking directly at them. Then Lily sighed and pointed. On the wall ahead, scrawled in something dark and wet, were 4 words. "He is awake." The inscription was dripping, and the liquid collected on the stone floor. It was not ink. It was not paint. The smell was unmistakable. It was exactly what they thought it was. Natalie began to breathe more rapidly. "This isn't funny anymore." "It was never funny," Ethan muttered, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. Jake swallowed hard. "Look, Sam could have done it. Maybe as a joke? He likes horror." No one believed him. There was a sudden crash in the hallway, with cracking, something falling. It came from the direction of the sleeping quarters. They turned around, their flashlights running wildly along the walls. The sound came from their room. "Did we leave the door open?" Natalie asked, her voice quiet. "No," they hadn't. And yet, when they approached the entrance, the wooden door hung on one hinge, as if something had been thrown through it. Ethan hesitated before stepping inside. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room. The sleeping bags had been cut open, and their stuffing was spilling out onto the floor like entrails. Prayer books were torn open, pages scattered, and in the center of the room, deeply scratched into the wooden floor, was one word. "Wake up," Lily sobbed. "We have to go." Ethan turned to Jake. "What do you think?" Jake's face went pale. "I think—" He stopped talking, his eyes widening. Something moved in the darkness outside the doorway. Not footsteps, not a shadow. It was crawling. A guttural, wet sound, like breathing through broken glass. And then the whispering came back, closer this time. "You're awake?" The flashlight flashed again, and the screaming began. A scream cut through the musty air as the flashlight flickered on again. The beam ran wildly across the room, illuminating nothing but their terrified faces. The whispering disappeared. The creeping sound stopped. But something was different. "The door," Lily gasped. They all turned around. The entrance to the monastery, the massive, ancient door through which they had entered, was no longer there. Instead, a stone wall stretched seamlessly where the doorway had been. It was as if the monastery had been locked shut. "No," Natalie gasped, rushing to the wall. She ran her hands over the cold stone, frantically searching for a seam, a crack, anything. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Jake stepped back, his voice barely audible. "We're trapped." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. "No, there has to be another way out. We'll find Sam, and we'll dash." A sharp sound cut him off. A long, scraping sound. They turned in unison. On the opposite side of the hallway, just beyond the destroyed sleeping quarters, something was standing in the doorway. At first it looked like a person, but the longer they stared, the more irregular it became. It was too tall, its limbs too thin. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, as if its neck were stretched and broken. The fingers were too long, and each one had something sharp on it that glistened in the dim light. The monster took a step forward. Its bare feet scraped against the stone. The air thickened with the stench of rot. Natalie groaned. "Oh my God!" The thing moved again, and then it spoke. Not with words, but with voices. All of their voices, intertwined, overlapping in an echoing chorus. "You're asleep, and he's not." Lily was the first to break down. She let out a strangled sob and ran out into the hallway. The others followed, their footsteps pounding on the stone floor. They ran blindly through the dark corridors, turning corners without thinking, without knowing where they were going, only knowing that they had to run away. Somewhere behind them, the monster followed them. It was not running. It did not need to. It was just moving. They didn't stop until they reached a door at the end of a long corridor. Ethan grabbed the rusty handle and yanked it open. Inside was a chapel. It was massive, with high vaulted ceilings and rows of crumbling benches. The walls were covered with stained glass windows, the images on which were faded and cracked. In the center of the altar was a massive wooden crucifix. Beneath it, kneeling on the cold stone floor, was Sam. Natalie let out a cry of relief and rushed forward. "Sam! Oh my God, we—" She stopped. Sam didn't turn around. He didn't react at all. His head was bowed, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. His clothes were covered in dust, as if he had been sitting there for years. Ethan took a cautious step forward. "Sam?" The air was thick, suffocating. Then Sam's head jerked. Not like a man waking up, more like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. His voice was dry, cracked. "He is awake." And then the candles on the altar flashed. Behind them, in the dark corridor, something laughed. A sound that did not belong to a person. A sound that promised that the night was just beginning. The chapel door slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom, the sound echoing off the stone walls. A sudden gust of air snuffed out all but one of the candles, leaving the space in a dim, flickering light. Sam was still kneeling at the altar, unmoving, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Sam?" Ethan took another cautious step forward. The air around him seemed different than before, thicker, as if the atmosphere itself had gained weight. Sam's head jerked again, a slow, jerky movement. "He's awake." His voice was hollow, like an echo of something that had been said a long time ago. Lily sobbed in panic. "What's wrong with him?" Jake swallowed hard, shaking his head. "We have to get him out of here. We need to find a way out of this place." Natalie moved closer to Sam and reached for his shoulder. "Sam, please, get up." The second she touched him, his head snapped up. His eyes were empty. Two dark, empty sockets stared back at her, a deep black void where his pupils should have been. His lips curled into a hard, unnatural smile. And then, not in his own voice, he whispered, "You must not wake up." Natalie screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a broken bench. Ethan grabbed her before she hit the ground, pulling her away from Sam's figure, who was still on his knees. The shadows in the chapel deepened. The light of the remaining candles flickered, casting horrific shapes on the walls. Something moved at the edge of their vision, watching. Then Sam stood up. But it was wrong. His body unfolded with a slow, deliberate movement, as if he had been tied too tightly for too long. His joints crunched loudly, his fingers twitched as if feeling the air for the first time. His temperature dropped. The breath of the other four friends came out with visible gasps. Jake whispered barely audibly, "We have to go. Now." Sam took a step forward, and then another. His feet barely touched the ground. His body moved like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings, his limbs bent at unnatural angles. Lily grabbed Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What's happening to him?" Natalie, still trembling, pointed to the altar. That thing above him." They all looked up. There was a massive crucifix above the altar. But something was wrong. The figure of Christ hanging on the cross was no longer there. Instead, the wood was empty except for deep scratches where the hands had once been nailed. A slow creaking sound echoed through the chapel. The crucifix began to lean forward, splitting at the edges, as if someone was trying to break through it. Then, from the deep shadows behind the altar, a voice whispered, "He's awake." The wood cracked. Something crawled out from behind the broken crucifix. At first, in the dim candlelight, it was impossible to see. But then it moved, long fingers, too many fingers, reaching for the stone. The head, faceless except for its too wide mouth, stretched in a perpetual smile. It reached forward with an unnatural grace, its limbs connected in a way that defied logic. Sam laughed. Or at least the thing in Sam's body laughed. "You can't leave," it said in his voice. Jake lost his temper. He rushed to the side door, ignoring Ethan's hissing warning. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open into blackness. Not a corridor. Not another room. Just a gaping void. A strong wind sucked at Jake's clothes, pulling him forward. He recoiled, eyes wide. What the hell? Something was moving inside the void. Something huge. A shape moving in the darkness, invisible but tangible. A presence that pressed on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. A hand, if you could call it a hand, stretched out from the darkness. It was the size of a human body. Natalie screamed as it reached for Jake. He barely had time to jump back. The void closed. The door closed by itself. And Sam laughed. Lily began to sob. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But Ethan knew the truth. It was very real. He turned to Sam's twisted form. "What do you want from us?" Sam's too wide smile spread even wider. The skin at the edges of his lips cracked, dark liquid oozing down his chin. "He wants you to sleep." The words echoed through the chapel, sinking into their bones. And then, in a moment, the candles went out. The room was engulfed in darkness. And then, a moment later, the light returned. Lily was gone. All that remained was the faint whisper of her last breath hanging in the air. Silence strangled the chapel, thick and suffocating. Lily was gone. Ethan's chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths as he scanned the empty space where she had stood. No blood. No footprints. Just nothing. Natalie shivered, clasping her hands over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing. Jake, this time, had no smug remark, his face pale, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal. What had once been Sam tilted his head, and that too-wide smile stretched further than was humanly possible. Something dark, something wrong, dripped from the edges of his lips. She's already asleep. Ethan clenched his fists as he took a slow step forward. Where did she go? The smile didn't disappear. Where all sleepers go. The shadows in the chapel world stretched out like grasping hands. The walls of the ancient monastery groaned, a sound like something deep down waking up. Jake lost his temper. He started up again, slamming his shoulder into the chapel door. This time they opened, but the corridor behind them was different. No more cold stone. No more dusty ruins. Instead, it was endless rows of wooden beds, each with a person sitting on it. People, but not human. Their bodies lay motionless, wrapped in tattered sheets, their chests rising and falling slightly. Their faces were familiar. Ethan felt his stomach twist as the flashlight beams swept over them. They looked just like Lily, and Sam, and so many others. Not hundreds, thousands. Each one a perfect, unmoving replica of someone who had once entered this place. Natalie choked back a sob as she stepped back. No, 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 this isn't real. This is a dream. It's not real. Jake stumbled over to one of the cribs and reached out a trembling hand. His fingers barely touched the cold cheek of a figure that looked like Lily, but her eyes did not move. She didn't breathe. She didn't react. Her body was here, but something inside was gone. Lily, Jake whispered. Then, without warning, her eyes opened. But they weren't her eyes anymore. They were nothing. A black void. The monster in her body turned its head toward Jake, slowly, jerkingly, like a puppet being moved by invisible hands. Its mouth opened, and then, in its own voice, it whispered, "You must sleep." Jake screamed as the monstrosity lunged at him, its cold, dead fingers wrapped around his throat. Ethan and Natalie yanked him back just in time, and the three of them took off running, fleeing through the endless rows of motionless bodies. The air in the monastery grew thicker. The low hum of the breathing of something ancient vibrated through the walls, through their bones. They ran. The corridor twisted and stretched, doors changing at every turn. Each path led to another identical room of sleepers. There was no way out. There was no way out. No way out. Natalie stumbled. She fell to the ground with a loud crash, her head hitting the stone floor. Ethan stopped, reaching for her. Natalie, get up. Her eyes were wide open, unfocused. Her mouth opened, but there was another voice. He's awake. The darkness rushed forward, and she was gone. And so was Lily. And so was Sam. Jake grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him back. We have to move. We have to. Too late. A huge force slammed into them, sending them flying. The world spun, shadows swallowed up the light. And then, silence. Ethan woke up. The sky was gray. It was a dark, dead morning. He was lying on the damp grass near the ruins of a monastery. Jake lay next to him, stirring drunkenly. The monastery was no longer the same. Just a ruined building, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The entrance was sealed, the massive wooden door now fused to the stone. There was no sign of Natalie, no sign of Sam, no sign of Lily. Only Ethan and Jake were left. Jake sat up slowly, holding his head. What happened? Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know. Everything was a blur in his head. The memories of what had happened inside twisted and turned like a half-forgotten nightmare, slipping through his fingers as he tried to grasp them. But something was wrong. The world seemed wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Jake let out a shaky breath. We made it. Ethan wasn't sure. The last thing he remembers is that he fell into the darkness. And now, just like that, they were on the street? Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Jake stood up and looked at the road. Come on, buddy. We need to get the hell out of here. Ethan hesitated, then slowly followed him. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked back. Not at the monastery. Not at the shadows moving in the windows. Nor at the figures standing absolutely still, watching them go. They walked in silence until the ruins disappeared behind the trees. Jake laughed weakly. God, I can't believe we... Ethan turned to look at him. Jake froze. Ethan's eyes were black. A slow, cold smile stretched across his lips. And in a voice not his own, he whispered, "He's awake." The last thing Jake heard was the wind carrying a distant, echoing whisper. The whisper of Lily's voice. Go back to sleep. And then everything went dark.